As many of you may have recognized, the title of this paper is borrowed from Mark Lamont Hill and Mitchell Plitnick in their 2021 book, Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics. There they explore what is widely known as the progressive except for Palestine phenomenon, with which many of us are all too familiar, I'm sure. A phenomenon in which self-styled liberals and progressives hold views on Palestine uniquely at odds with their politics otherwise. While centrist, conservative, and fascist positions on the question of Palestine and Israel's current genocidal assault on Gaza are unlikely to surprise anyone left of center, there exists a not insignificant segment of self-identified progressives that contradict themselves on the question of Palestine, a segment for whom Palestine is, for whatever reason, an exception. This paper considers a specific example of this within a progressive Christian context, and it proceeds in three parts. The first is a brief survey of the liberal media landscape in the United States since October 2023 on the question of Palestine and the genocide in Gaza. The second part investigates the degree to which self-styled progressive Christian media differentiates itself from the larger ecology of liberal media. Examining the Christian Century's recent editorial position on the genocide, together with another article in particular, I argue that not mainline, not liberal, but apparently progressive Christian Zionism has betrayed itself in the Century in recent months, demonstrating the progressive except for Palestine phenomenon within a center-left Christian community. Finally, the practical theologian that I am, I discuss a practical, political, and experimental intervention intended to challenge this Zionism from a far leftist Christian perspective. So part one. Liberal media in the U.S. has long demonstrated overwhelming bias in favor of Israel. Over the past 7 months alone, this has been made abundantly clear. In January 2024, analysts Adam Johnson and Ahmed Ali published a quantitative open-source analysis of the New York Times, Washington Post, and Los Angeles Times, establishing that all three newspapers inordinately foregrounded Israeli deaths, even as Palestinian deaths exponentially outpaced them, used evocative terms to describe the killing of Israelis, but not the killing of Palestinians, conspicuously ignored the killing of children and journalists despite the unprecedented nature of both, and disproportionately covered anti-Semitic activity in the U.S. relative to Islamophobic activity. In late March 2024, media studies scholar Robin Anderson analyzed a series of headlines after what became known as the Flower Massacre, during which Israeli snipers massacred more than 100 Palestinians and injured at least 700 more as they approached aid trucks containing flour. Quote, with headlines layered in verbal opacity, the massacre prompted yet another egregious moment in media's facilitation of Israel's continuing genocide in Gaza, she wrote. In April 2024, after months of independent investigations into the veracity of a Times report alleging systematic sexual violence by Hamas on October 7th, more than 60 scholars, I think it was 70 at the last, of journalism collectively called for an independent review of the article and its publication process, noting the lack of experience and integrity of its authors, as well as clear instances of fraudulence in their reporting. Also in April 2024, investigative reporters Jeremy Scahill and Ryan Grimm obtained an internal memo written by top editors at the New York Times, which circulated only a month into Israel's genocidal assault, directing journalists to refrain from using terms like genocide, ethnic cleansing, occupied territory, refugee camps, and even the word Palestine itself. A similar memo circulated at CNN, I understand, too. Despite Israel's near-total ban of foreign journalists inside Gaza, with the notable exception of those who embedded with the IDF, combined with its evidenced pattern of journalistic bias and malpractice, of course the New York Times won a Pulitzer Prize in May 2024 specifically for international reporting on the Hamas attack and Israel's military response. On its parody website, called the New York War Crimes, The Writers Against the War on Gaza Coalition notes that the New York Times is, quote, exemplary but not unique among media in manufacturing consent for war, for exploitation, for genocide. Indeed, in November 2023, an analysis published in The Column underscored tight ideological alignment across CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News and their biases against Palestinians. 1 week after the Hamas attack, MSNBC sidelined 3 of its Muslim anchors, one of whom was broadcaster Mehdi Hassan. The following month, Hassan's show was canceled altogether, and he resigned from the network. Disproportionate in a different way was the Atlantic Monthly's coverage over roughly the same early time period. A report published at the Real News Network established that in the first 2 weeks after the Hamas attack, the Atlantic ran 38 pieces on the unfolding situation, only one of which was written by a Palestinian. The ostensibly liberal magazine has thoroughly betrayed itself as incandescently Zionist ever since, publishing pieces that are so belligerently and preposterously pro-Israel, one could be forgiven for confusing the Atlantic with the satirical American newspaper, The Onion. Illustrative of the Atlantic's offerings since October 2023 is a headline by staff writer Graham Wood, which reads, "Charge Palestine with genocide too." I'm shaking. This is making me so angry. I feel like I'm... To be sure, liberal media in the U.S. is effectively indistinguishable from centrist and conservative media on the question of Palestine. Given the deep theological connection that Christians have to the region, one wonders how liberal Christian media compares. One wonders how progressive Christian media compares. Taking the Christian century as an example, what we find is that progressive Christian media, too, is decidedly progressive except for Palestine. Founded in 1884 and taking its current name in 1900, church historian Alicia Kaufman describes the Christian century as, quote, the flagship periodical of mainline liberal American Protestants throughout the first half of the 20th century, decades during which mainline and liberal were essentially synonymous. And the magazine counted among its peers The Nation, The New Republic, and Commonweal. Throughout these decades, historian Caitlin Karanen goes so far as to describe the century as, quote, ardently anti-Zionist, as late as the 1940s. Interestingly, in Karenen's view, the century's anti-Zionist stance held steady for another couple decades, and at one point, quote, the consistently hostile attitude toward Israel displayed in the pages of the Christian century represented a defensive viewpoint rather than a representative position of liberal American Protestants. A lot has changed since then, as new developments have made clear. In September 2022, the Century updated its tagline, which now consists of 3 words: thoughtful, independent, progressive. As it relates to the third, progressive, editor and publisher Peter Marty confessed to readers, quote, although for many people this word denotes a political label, at the Century it represents a kind of Christianity we take to be broad-minded and forward-looking, he explains. Our journalistic center of gravity is grounded in theological commitments that are open and expansive, not closed and exclusive. We care about the common good, the shape of human community, and the role that good journalism plays in helping create a more just society, end quote. In my mind, this is a most convenient hedge. The Century wants to capitalize on the cultural cachet associated with political progressivism while excusing itself from progressivism's material political commitments, favoring values so generalized and benign they become meaningless. Still, the Century describes itself as, quote, a progressive, independent religious magazine devoted to helping people think critically and live in the Christian faith thoughtfully. From October to December 2023, the Century published just 5 pieces related to the genocide in Gaza, one of which was an editorial titled Bearing Witness to Multiple Stories, published both online and in the December 2023 print edition. In my view, this editorial is both sidesism in its purest, most unadulterated form, a masterpiece in presenting a balance so false and therefore so biased and intellectually insulting that if true, admittedly, it would be impossible to refute. Alas, it is not. The editors contend that the state of affairs in Palestine is marked by, quote, two overarching stories, each the story of a people, end quote. Both are traumatized, both are connected to the land, both commit violence against each other, both work against lasting peace. And here I'm quoting the editorial at length. Every conflict involves competing stories, but often one story clearly embodies far more truth than the other. Not in this case. Each of the two stories sketched out here is factually sound, historically informed, and morally compelling. Both stories are true, and they are heartbreaking and tragic. Both are stories of a people who love the land and deserve to live there in peace. Peace has long been stymied by political missteps, cycles of violence, and interventions by those who can only see one story's truth. For you as Christians, bearing witness to this conflict begins with recognizing that it contains more than one true story, end quote. Like Graham Wood's Atlantic headline above, this editorial more rightfully belongs in The Onion. No mention of imperialism, settler colonialism, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, material and military asymmetry, and certainly no mention of genocide. Indeed, this is both sidesism distilled. Later in February 2024, the editors saw fit to publish an article in the digital edition by Cantor Olivia Brodsky and Rabbi Joshua Stanton titled, 10 Ways to Criticize Israel That Aren't Anti-Semitic. The second paragraph of this astonishingly paternalistic article reads as follows, and here I quote again at length. Respected colleagues and friends have accused Israel of genocide, a trope akin to Holocaust inversion and deeply painful to those of us who have family trees more dead than alive. Others speak of apartheid in Israel, even though Palestinian Israeli citizens comprise 20% of the population and serve in high office. We see anti-Semitism when Christian leaders label Israeli Jews white colonialists, even though the Jewish people are indigenous to Israel and the majority of Israeli Jews are people of color who have returned to their ancestral homeland, one which some never left at all. We observe it in an excessive focus on the war in Gaza and relentless criticism of Israel to the exclusion of other countries, end quote. They go on later in this piece, they use the word permissible at one point. They say, these are what we see as permissible things that Christians can say about the genocide, about what's happening. Upon reading this, I reached out to the editors to pitch a thoughtful refutation, a thorough refutation. Finally, a month later, they declined, but invited a letter to the editor instead, which I promptly submitted. Soon I found out that the above article, which ran in February, originally online, would run in the May 2024 print issue, and my letter would run the following month in June, together with another letter to the editor, also critical of both this article and the editorial above, as well as a response from the authors of the article and a response from the Century's editors. Predictably, the author's response was just more naked, cliched propaganda. Much more telling is that 7 months after first publishing their both sides editorial, that is 7 months during which tens of thousands more Palestinians were slaughtered, maimed, and starved, during which Israel dropped the equivalent of one atomic bomb after another on Gaza, the editors not only defended their original editorial, they quoted from it. In effect, they doubled down. They also defended the publication of the ridiculous anti-Semitism piece as well. Rosemary Radford Ruther has discussed both mainline and liberal Christian Zionism. More recently, so has Mitri Raheb. Far from a voice of truth crying out in the liberal media wilderness to discuss the limits of progressive Christianity, at least in the case outlined above, is perhaps to discuss the emergence, or rather maybe the constancy, of progressive Christian Zionism. In other words, a progressive Christianity except for Palestine. It's my last page, the conclusion. In its classic and indispensable work, The Question of Palestine, Edward Said insists that, quote, writing does count for something, and so certain points have to be made, end quote. Last November, through my postdoctoral fellowship, I was looped in with a small group of leftist Christians in the American South. Shortly thereafter, a new movement called Christians for a Free Palestine, CFP, emerged. In March 2024, we organized a national day of action in cities throughout the country. Then in April, we met in Washington, D.C., where we worshiped together with a communion service at which Mitri spoke on the lawn of the U.S. Capitol, after which roughly 60 of us were arrested after successfully shutting down the cafeteria inside the Dirksen Senate office building, where we insisted that senators would not eat until Gazans could eat, and otherwise called for a ceasefire. Next month, through my work with CFP and my fellowship at the Highlander Center in Tennessee, I will begin to organize a national working group, a writers' collective, consisting of ordinary leftist Christians to make both mass and targeted, but in every case coordinated, ideally, and distinctly Christian contributions to the narrative aspect of the struggle for a free Palestine. Indeed, writing counts, and certain points have to be made. Too frequently, leftist Christians are left submitting isolated and defensive letters to the editor, like me, like mine, instead of proactively organizing coordinated writing campaigns. Said once admitted that most major newspapers are unlikely to run anything without sending it through their Jerusalem bureaus, but that smaller, more local and regional newspapers tend to make room for pro-Palestinian voices, at least as of around 2000, when I think he said this. From hometown weeklies to international newspapers, media is a critical site of struggle where Christians can register dissent and correct the narrative around Palestine. It is also where progressive Christians, except for Palestine, can be held accountable for their exception, and then quieted, and then hopefully converted for good. Thanks.